Today we'll be learning how to knit stockinette in this really gorgeous yarn called Happy Place, which is a new yarn created by Toni of TL Yarn Crafts and Hobbii Yarns. It is a beautiful DK weight 50/50 merino wool cotton blend, and I've really been enjoying knitting up my stockinette stitch swatch. So let's talk about stockinette stitch. This is for my new knitters looking to get comfy with stockinette stitch. It's a basic but beautiful stitch, as well as for my experienced knitters looking for that joyful swatch inspo. Stockinette is a fundamental knitting pattern characterized by smooth, flat fabric on the right side and bumpy, textured fabric on the wrong side. It's created by alternating these rows of knit stitches and purl stitches, and it's really great for indulging in various projects. Now, we'll be casting on in the Happy Place color Cinnamon using the recommended needle size, which is US 6 4mm. Let's start by casting on 20 stitches using the long tail cast on, and this is often abbreviated LTCO, to work our 4x4 inch square swatch. And you'll often see this as a 10 by 10 centimeter. So my little trick for working LTCO is I give myself a little bit of a tail here, and then I just wrap the yarn around the needle for as many stitches as I desire. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Then you can just slide the yarn off, and then we can cast on. Now, if you are not quite comfortable with the long tail cast on method, it's definitely worth some research. It's a very standard beginner cast on method, but just continue casting on your 20 stitches and I will meet you at the 20th stitch. Now that we have our 20 stitches cast on, we're ready to work our row 1. You'll commonly see this known as the right side, abbreviated RS in knitting stitch patterns. We'll begin by knitting our first 19 stitches, and for a cleaner, prettier edge, I like to slip my last stitch. So when we get to that last stitch, I'll show you how to do that. But let's go ahead and start knitting. To knit our stitches, make sure that we are not knitting into our tail. Here we go. We'll insert our right needle into the stitch on the left needle from left to right. You'll hear this as if to knit. Your yarn should be behind your needle. You want to make sure it's not in the front. You want the yarn behind the needle, and you'll wrap the yarn around counterclockwise. Pull the yarn through the stitch, creating a new stitch on the right needle by sliding the original stitch off of the left needle. Okay, let's do that again. Make sure our tail is out of the way. Our yarn is behind our needle. With our right needle, we'll go into the stitch as if to knit, wrap the yarn around counterclockwise around the stitch, pull the needle through the yarn, creating a new stitch on the right needle and sliding the original stitch off of the left needle. Right needle goes in under the stitch as if to knit, wrap the yarn around, pull the yarn through, and knit. And let's just keep going. With your right needle again, you'll put the needle under the stitch, wrapping the yarn around, pulling the yarn through. You want to make sure that your stitches remain evenly spaced, like so. And really just getting comfortable, getting the right needle there under the stitch, wrapping the yarn around counterclockwise, creating the new stitch on the right needle while sliding the original stitch off of the left needle. And even though we did long tail cast on method, I like to keep my tail kind of short and keep it out of the way. We're coming up on our last few stitches here, so I'll slow down a bit so you can see it more. Taking your right needle, slide it under the stitch on the left needle, wrap the yarn around counterclockwise, pull the yarn through the stitch, creating the new stitch on your right needle. And if you see the original stitch on the left needle, slide that off to create your new stitch. So again, for that pretty clean edge, instead of knitting this last stitch, what I'll do is bring my yarn to the front of my needle, and I will just slip this stitch off of the needle, known as a slip stitch. And I'll bring the yarn over the stitch like so. So it sort of creates this faux bump, and it'll give us that nice, clean, pretty edge as we continue to work. And we've just knit our first row. Now that we have our first row knit, we're ready to work row 2. This is often known as our wrong side. You'll see abbreviated as WS in most knitting patterns. What we'll do is we'll turn our work so that the wrong side, the bumpy side, is facing. For the second row and all subsequent wrong side rows, we'll purl across the row. So in order to purl our stitch for that clean, pretty edge, we're going to start off by just knitting the first stitch, like so. Now we're ready to purl. So after we knit that first stitch, we'll want to bring our yarn to the front of the work, and we'll insert our right needle from right to left into the first stitch on the left needle. You'll commonly hear this as if to purl. We'll wrap our yarn around the needle and pull the yarn through the stitch, creating our new stitch on the right needle, sliding the original stitch off of the left needle. Sound familiar? Okay, let's do it again. With the yarn in the front of our work, as opposed to when we were knitting, we had our yarn in the back of the work. Have the yarn in the front of our work. With our right needle, we'll go into the stitch as if to purl, wrap the yarn around the needle, creating the new stitch and sliding the original stitch off of the left needle. So let's work a couple of those purl stitches. Right needle into the stitch, wrap the yarn around, pull the needle through the yarn, creating the new stitch. Right needle goes through the stitch, wrap the yarn around, pull the needle through the yarn, creating the new stitch and sliding the original stitch off of the left needle. Once you really start to get the hang of it, it starts to feel a bit like a dance. So let's just work a couple of those purl stitches like so. And it might take you a bit to get kind of comfortable. A lot of times beginner knitters feel a bit more comfortable working the row 1 and the knit rows versus the row 2 and purl rows. But just take your time, making sure your stitches are evenly spaced, practicing keeping your yarn in the front of the work, bringing the needle into the stitch, wrapping the yarn around, pulling the yarn through onto the right needle and off of the left needle. And you'll want to work your purl stitches all the way until the last stitch. So here we are at our last stitch, and we're ready for that pretty clean edge. Now since the yarn is already in the front of the work, all we need to do is just slip that stitch. Might be a little bit of spacing there, that's normal. And again, just like we did on the first row, we'll bring the yarn around the stitch, creating that faux bump that looks really similar to our actual purl stitches, right? And we've just knit our row 2. So after completing row 2, we'll want to begin our repeats of alternating between our knit rows and our purl rows in order to create our stockinette stitch. I've worked up a few more rows here in our stockinette stitch by again alternating our knit stitches that create this nice smooth fabric on the front and our purl stitches that create this textured bumpy fabric on the back. We're here on our first stitch. I'm going to go ahead and insert the right needle into the stitch, wrap the yarn around, pull the yarn through, creating the new stitch on the right needle and slipping the original stitch off of the left needle to create our knit stitch. And for these first 19 stitches, we'll be knitting across until we get to our last stitch. And that first stitch may be a little bit wonky there. You can go ahead and tighten that up a little bit if you need to. Just keep taking that right needle under the stitch, wrapping the yarn around counterclockwise, pulling the yarn through, creating the new stitch on the right needle, and slipping that original stitch, letting it drop off of the left needle. Really taking your time to create each knit stitch. And we'll just continue to knit. I really enjoy knitting stockinette because it's just knit, knit, knit on the front side of the work. And here we're coming up on our last 2 stitches, so we'll go ahead and knit that last stitch. And so that we can have our clean, pretty edge, give myself some working yarn here. I'll bring my yarn to the front of my right needle, and I'll just slip that stitch off of the left needle, let it drop. It's creating that little bit of space there, and I'll bring the yarn around the stitch in order to create that faux bump. And I've just worked the right side of my work. Now let's continue knitting the subsequent row 2 wrong side rows with my purl stitches. So to continue with that pretty edge, I'll enter the needle under the stitch, and I'll knit this first stitch. Then I will bring my yarn to the front of my needle, get that right needle under the stitch, wrap the yarn around, pull the yarn through, creating the new stitch on the right needle, slipping the original stitch off of the left needle. Let's just continue to purl our stitches, starting our needle as if to purl, wrapping the yarn around, pulling the yarn through to create the new stitch. And we'll want to purl our first 19 stitches. We're at our last 2 stitches here. So I'm going to go ahead and purl that stitch. The yarn is already in the front of our work. So all I have to do is slip this stitch, bring the yarn over, and we've just knit our row 2 purl stitches. So you'll want to just continue to work alternating your right side and wrong side rows between your knit stitches and your purl stitches until you get to your 4x4 inch square swatch, or whichever desired length of swatch you'd like. Sometimes I work in 4x4 inch, sometimes I may do a 5x5 inch swatch. So we're just a few rows away from finishing our 4x4 inch swatch. Once you get to row 30, you'll be ready to bind off. So I want to walk you through how to do a standard bind off. It's pretty simple, very fun to indulge in. You'll want to insert your right needle into the stitch, and you just knit the stitch like normal. So again, we want to insert the needle under the stitch, wrapping the yarn around, knitting the new stitch, and sliding the original stitch off of the left needle, just like we were doing on our right side rows. In order to bind off, however, you'll want to take your left needle, slide the needle under the first stitch that you knit, and pull it up and over the second stitch to pull it off of the right needle. Now, as you're doing the standard bind off, you'll always want to have 2 stitches on your right needle at a time. So we'll go ahead and knit another stitch. And then with our left needle, we'll go under that first stitch, slide it up and over. You want to be careful not to slide the stitch off, the second stitch off of the needle, up and over that second stitch in order to bind it off. Knit another stitch. With the left needle, go under the first stitch, pull it up and over the second stitch, which would be the stitch that you just knit, in order to bind off. Knit your next stitch, slide your left needle under the first stitch, up and over the stitch you just knit, and bind off. And we'll just continue that repeat. And I'd say once you get about halfway through your swatch, you can really start to see those bind offs, which I think sometimes look really nicely with their clean edges. And I just sort of like to get in the habit of doing my clean edges in case I'm going to knit 2 swatches together or want to mirror that in my pattern. Stockinette can tend to curl up on itself, so you can always add a garter stitch row, some type of ribbing border, but I do think the natural curling of stockinette can be quite beautiful. So we're just going to continue here. Knitting to make sure we have 2 stitches on the right needle, and then using the left needle, sliding the first stitch over the stitch that we just knit in order to bind off. So we're here at our last stitch. So we'll want to go ahead and just knit into that stitch. So we have no more stitches left on our left needle, but we'll still want to go ahead with the left needle, go into that first stitch, pull it up and over, bind it off, and now we have exactly 1 stitch left on the needle. And with our Happy Place mini scissors, we can go ahead and cut about, I'd say anywhere between a 4 and 6 inch tail, and then you can just thread that yarn through in order to secure your stitches. I hope that you've enjoyed learning the knit stitch, the purl stitch, how to alternate between your right and wrong side rows, really getting comfortable with slipping your stitches and your bind off. Continue practice and indulge in stockinette stitch, this beautiful foundational knit pattern, and happy knitting.